You think you know the story of Little Red Riding Hood, a sweet girl, a red cape, a big bad wolf, and a heroic woodcutter who swoops in to save the day. It's the perfect bedtime story, right? But that story is a lie. It is a sanitized fraud, a deliberate cover-up invented by aristocrats to hide a reality so disturbing it was scrubbed from history books for 300 years. Because in the original tale, the one told by French peasants around flickering fires, there is no Red Hood. There is no heroic huntsman. And the girl doesn't just visit her grandmother, she is tricked into eating her flesh and drinking her blood. Today, we are uncovering the brutal, true history of a story that wasn't originally a fairy tale, but a survival guide. We'll expose how a medieval narrative about female cunning and raw survival was deliberately, violently rewritten into a weapon of social control. This is a journey into the dark heart of 17th century France, a time when werewolf trials saw thousands burned at the stake and where the monster in the bed wasn't a metaphor. Forget the Disney version, put the children to bed, because the version you know is a forgery. And the truth? It involves cannibalism, sexual coercion, and a girl who didn't need a man to save her. To understand the true horror of this story, we have to strip away the nursery. We have to go back to a time before electricity, before the police, and before the concept of childhood even existed. We are going back to the French countryside of the 16th and 17th centuries. This wasn't a world of magic, it was a world of famine. In these villages, death was a neighbor. Winters were long, food was scarce, and the forest wasn't a place of wonder, it was a place where people disappeared. And in this brutal reality, the story wasn't called Little Red Riding Hood. The peasants simply called it the story of grandmother. Picture the protagonist. She isn't wearing a red hood. That detail wouldn't exist for another 100 years. She is just a village girl. She is nameless, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, and she is tough. She has to be. In medieval peasant society, children weren't pampered. They were miniature adults who worked the fields and knew exactly where meat came from. And the wolf? In the original oral tradition, he isn't just a wild animal. He is a bzoo, a werewolf. You have to understand, for the French peasants telling this story around the fire, the werewolf wasn't a movie monster, it was a headline. Between 1520 and 1630, France was gripped by a mass hysteria known as the werewolf witch trials. Over 30,000 people were accused, tortured, and executed for the crime of lycanthropy, transforming into wolves to devour children. This wasn't folklore to them. It was current events. They knew names like Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg, a man accused of killing 14 children and eating the fetus from a pregnant woman's womb. When Stump was executed in 1589, he was strapped to a wheel, his flesh torn from his bones with red-hot pincers before he was beheaded. This is the blood-soaked soil from which our bedtime story grew. The bzoo in the tale was a reflection of this very real, very specific terror. The idea that a predator could walk on two legs, speak with a human voice, and hide in plain sight. In the story of Grandmother, the girl meets this bzoo at a crossroads. He asks her where she is going. She tells him. And here, the story takes a strange, ritualistic turn that modern versions have completely erased. The werewolf asks her, "Which path will you take? The path of needles or the path of pins?" This isn't just random dialogue. In the localized folklore of the Loire Valley, needles and pins were associated with the tools of young women, seamstresses, and makers. It was a test of character, a flirtatious game with death. The girl, innocent but bold, chooses the path of needles. The wolf takes the path of pins. He beats her to the cottage. And this is where the story descends into a nightmare that Disney wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The wolf kills the grandmother, but he doesn't swallow her whole. That is a cartoon invention. In the original French oral tales, the violence is deliberate and domestic. He butchers her. He puts her flesh into the pantry on a platter and pours her blood into a bottle on the shelf. Then, he gets into bed. When the girl arrives, she is hungry from her walk. The wolf, disguising his voice, tells her to help herself to the food in the pantry. I want you to really process this image. The girl, in the dim light of the cottage, sits down at the table. She eats the meat. She drinks the wine. In many versions of this oral tale, a small cat or a bird on the mantelpiece cries out a warning, "Slut! Slut! You are eating your grandmother's flesh and drinking her blood. But the girl doesn't understand. She finishes her meal. She has unknowingly committed the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. The wolf has tricked her into desecrating her own lineage. This wasn't a story about don't talk to strangers. It was a story about the absolute vulnerability of the body and the soul. But the horror isn't over. The wolf then calls out to her, "Undress, my child, and come sleep beside me." The girl asks, "Where should I put my apron?" The wolf replies, "Throw it in the fire, my child. You won't need it anymore." She asks about her bodice, her skirt, her stockings. For each item, the wolf gives the same chilling response, "Throw it in the fire. You won't need it anymore." This ritualistic stripping is terrifying. With every piece of clothing she burns, she is burning her ties to the human world. The wolf is telling her, effectively, that she will never leave this bed. She is naked, vulnerable, and climbing into bed with a monster who has just fed her own family. She lies down. She notices his hairiness, his big shoulders, his long nails. She asks the famous questions, "What big teeth you have?" But in this version, the realization hits her differently. She realizes, lying there in the dark, that this is not her grandmother. She is in bed with the bzoo, and this is the moment where the history you know falls apart. In the version we are taught today, this is where the girl screams, or dies, or waits for a man with an axe. But the French peasant girl? She does none of those things. She doesn't panic. She goes cold. Her survival instincts kick in. She realizes that physical strength won't save her. The wolf is stronger. She is naked and unarmed. She has to use the only weapon she has left, her mind. She tells the wolf she needs to relieve herself. She needs to go outside to the privy. The wolf objects. He tells her to do it in the bed. She refuses. She insists she cannot be so unclean. Finally, the wolf agrees, but he is suspicious. He takes a strong woolen cord and ties it to her ankle so she cannot run. He holds the other end of the rope, like a leash. The girl goes outside. The moment she is out of sight, she unties the cord. But she doesn't just drop it, that would give her away instantly. She finds a heavy plum tree in the yard and ties the cord tightly to the trunk. Inside the cottage, the wolf waits. He tugs on the rope. He feels the resistance of the tree and thinks, "Good, she is still there." He waits, and he waits. Finally, he calls out, "Are you done? The rope is tight." There is no answer. By the time the wolf realizes he is holding a leash attached to a tree, the girl is gone. She has run back to the village, across the river where the wolf cannot follow, safe behind locked doors. In the original story, there is no huntsman. There is no father figure. There is no lesson about obeying your mother. The lesson was visceral and empowering. When you are faced with a monster, you save yourself. This was the story that French women told their daughters and granddaughters for generations. It was a story of female triumph. So, the question you should be asking is, how did this tale of a clever survivor girl turn into a tragedy about a helpless victim who needs a man to cut her out of a stomach? To find that answer, we have to leave the peasant villages and travel to the glittering, decadent court of Louis XIV, because that is where the assassination of this story began. We are leaving the mud of the peasant villages and entering the gilded cage of the French aristocracy. The year is 1697. The man holding the pen is Charles Perrault. Perrault was a high-ranking official under Louis XIV. He was a bourgeois intellectual, a man of the court, and a member of the Académie Française. When he decided to write down these folk tales in his book, Stories or Tales from Times Past, he wasn't acting as a historian. He wasn't trying to preserve the vulgar culture of the peasantry. He was a revisionist. He was taking raw, rough stones and polishing them into gems acceptable for the delicate sensibilities of the Parisian salons. But in polishing them, he didn't just clean them up. He fundamentally altered their DNA. The first thing Perrault did was give the girl a name, or rather, a label. He called her La Petite Chaperon Rouge, Little Red Riding Hood. This is critical. The Red Hood did not exist before 1697. Perrault invented it. And this wasn't just a cute fashion choice. In the highly coded language of 17th century France, clothing was communication. Respectable, middle-class women wore modest, muted colors. Red was the color of sin. It was the color of violent emotion. It was the color of sexual maturity. By wrapping this young girl in a bright red hood, Perrault was doing something insidious. He was marking her. He transformed her from an anonymous every woman survivor into a marked woman. The hood was a crimson beacon, signaling to every aristocrat reading the story that this girl was different, that she was, perhaps, looking for trouble. It was the 17th century equivalent of saying, "Look at what she was wearing." Perrault stripped away the vulgar elements. He removed the cannibalism that was too gross for the court. He removed the path of pins that was too obscure. But the most devastating thing he removed was the girl's brain. In Perrault's version, when the girl arrives at the cottage, the wolf tells her to undress and get into bed. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't plan. She doesn't spot the trap. She simply obeys. She strips naked and climbs into bed with the wolf. The scene in Perrault's version is undeniably, uncomfortably erotic. The dialogue, "What big arms you have," "the better to hug you with," takes on a double meaning in the context of the French court, where sexual intrigue was the currency of the day. The wolf isn't just a predator of flesh, he is a predator of virtue. And then comes the ending. And saying these words, this wicked wolf fell upon Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up. That's it. That is the end of Perrault's story. There is no ruse, there is no bathroom break, there is no tree, there is no survival. The girl is devoured. She dies a victim, punished for the crime of listening to the wolf, punished for the crime of wearing red, punished for the crime of existing in a space where she didn't belong. Perrault took a story about female empowerment and turned it into a tragedy about female stupidity. But why? Why change a story of triumph into a slaughter? The answer lies in the explicit moral that Perrault added to the end of the tale, a poem that most modern translations conveniently leave out. He writes, "Children, especially attractive, well-bred young ladies, should never talk to strangers, for if they should do so, they may well provide dinner for a wolf." I say wolf, but there are various kinds of wolves. There are also those who are charming, quiet, polite, unassuming, complacent, and sweet, who pursue young women at home and in the streets. He isn't talking about animals. He is talking about men. Perrault was writing during a time of social anxiety. Women in Paris were beginning to organize. They were hosting salons gatherings where they discussed philosophy, politics, and literature. They were becoming Precieuse's intellectual, witty, independent women who challenged male intellectual dominance. Conservative men like Perrault were terrified. They saw this female independence as a threat to the social order. We leave the sexual politics of the French court and fast forward a century, crossing the border into 19th century Germany. The year is 1812. Napoleon has torn Europe apart, and the German principalities are fractured. In this chaos, two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, set out to do something radical. They want to unite the German people not through borders, but through stories. But the version of Little Red Cap, Rotkäppchen, they produced wasn't just a folk tale. It was a manifesto for a new kind of society. If Perrault's version was a warning about sex, the Grimms' version was a manual on obedience. The Grimms had a problem. They didn't like the peasant version. A girl tricking a wolf was too subversive, too disrespectful of authority. But they also didn't like Perrault's ending. A girl simply dying was too bleak, too French, and offered no redemption. They needed a third option. They needed a way to save the girl. But, and this is the crucial part, they couldn't let her save herself. That would violate the strict gender roles of the 19th century German Biedermeier period, an era obsessed with order, family, and patriarchal protection. So, they invented a savior. They introduced the huntsman. In German, he is the Jäger. He is not just a random guy with an axe. In 19th century Germany, the Jäger was a uniformed forester, a figure of local law enforcement. He represented the state. He represented the law. He represented the father. By adding him, the Grimms fundamentally changed the physics of the story. No longer was this a battle of wits between a girl and a beast. It became a story about how the weak must wait for the strong to intervene. The rescue scene itself is bizarrely clinical. The huntsman finds the wolf sleeping. He realizes the grandmother might still be alive inside. He doesn't shoot the wolf. He takes a pair of scissors and performs a miraculous, bloodless cesarean section. Snip, snip, snip. Out pops Little Red Riding Hood, and then the grandmother, both alive, both unharmed. This moment is the final nail in the coffin of the girl's agency. In the peasant version, she escapes through her own cunning scatological ruse. In Perrault, she pays the ultimate price for her curiosity. But in the Grimm version, she is reduced to a passive object. She is literally birthed from the belly of the beast by a male authority figure. She learns nothing, does nothing, and risks nothing. She is simply saved. But the Grimms weren't done. They needed to make sure the child understood why this happened. They needed to encode the rules of their society into the text. This is why, in the Grimm version, the story doesn't start with the journey, it starts with a lecture. Before Red leaves the house, her mother gives her a very specific set of instructions that appear nowhere in the original oral traditions. Walk properly and don't stray from the path, otherwise you will fall and break the bottle, and then grandmother will get nothing. Stray from the path. This phrase has become so iconic we forget it was a piece of 19th century propaganda. The path is the straight and narrow road of bourgeois morality. It is the life script written for you by society. Go to school. Get married. Obey your husband. Be a good mother. Die. To step off the path, to chase butterflies, to talk to strangers, to explore the woods, is to invite chaos. The Grimms were teaching children that curiosity is dangerous and that safety lies only in strict adherence to the rules laid down by your parents. And let's talk about the punishment. After being rescued, Red Riding Hood doesn't run away. She helps the huntsman. She gathers heavy stones, and they fill the sleeping wolf's belly with them. When the wolf wakes up and tries to run, the weight of the stones collapses his lungs, and he dies. This addition serves a dual purpose. First, it sanitizes the violence. The wolf dies from heavy stones, not a blade. Second, it allows the girl to participate in the violence, but only under the supervision of the huntsman. She is allowed to be violent only when sanctioned by the state. The story ends with a thought bubble from Little Red Riding Hood herself. She thinks, "As long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the wood when my mother has forbidden me to do so." There it is, the complete indoctrination. The journey is complete. The peasant girl said, "I am smart enough to kill the monster." The Perrault girl screamed, "I made a mistake, and now I am dead." The Grimm girl whispers, "I will never disobey again." The Grimms successfully transformed a story of female liberation into a story of female subjugation. They took a hero and turned her into a cautionary tale about the necessity of the police state. But here is the twist. Here is the crack in the foundation that neither Perrault nor the Grimms could seal up. They thought they had fixed the story. They thought they had tamed the girl, but they were wrong, because this story doesn't just belong to France or Germany. When we zoom out and look at the rest of the world, we find something that shatters the Grimm's narrative of the helpless girl completely. It turns out the clever girl wasn't just a French anomaly. She is a global constant, and she has been waiting to be rediscovered. So far, we have been looking at this story through a microscopic lens, focusing on a few hundred years of French and German history. But if we widen the aperture, if we look at the entire human experience, the Grimm's version of the story stops looking like the definitive version and starts looking like what it really is, an anomaly, a glitch in the system. Because this story, the tale of the predator, the disguise, and the girl, is not local, it is universal. Folklorists and anthropologists use a system called the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index to classify folk tales. They don't use titles, they use numbers. And under the file ATU 333, the glutton, we find something remarkable. We find that the Little Red Riding Hood narrative exists in cultures that had absolutely no contact with the French court or the German middle class. And in almost every single one of these original iterations, the girl is not a victim. She is a warrior. Let's travel to Taiwan and China, where the story is known as the Tiger Grandmother or Grandaunt Tiger. The premise is terrifyingly familiar. A mother leaves her children at home to visit family. A tiger spirit, witnessing this, disguises itself as an elderly relative, the grandaunt. It tricks the children into opening the door. But here, the horror is dialed up. At night, the tiger shares a bed with the two children. In the darkness, the older sister hears a sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She asks the grandaunt what she is eating. "Just some peanuts," the tiger replies. "Can I have some?" The the girl asks. The tiger tosses a piece over. It isn't a peanut. It is the severed finger of her baby brother. This is the moment of truth. In the Grimm version, the girl would be paralyzed by fear or eaten, but the Taiwanese sister, she possesses that same ancient, razor-sharp cunning we saw in the French peasant version. She doesn't scream. She realizes that to scream is to die. She tells the tiger she needs to go to the bathroom. The tiger, suspicious, ties a rope to her leg, an exact parallel to the French tale, despite thousands of miles of separation. The girl escapes the rope, but she doesn't just run away. This is where the Asian variant surpasses the European one in terms of sheer righteous justice. She climbs a tree. When the tiger comes looking for her, she doesn't hide. She taunts it. She tells the tiger she has magic oil that makes her taste delicious. She convinces the monster to open its mouth wide, to close its eyes, and to wait for the treat. The girl pours boiling oil, or in some versions, hot stones straight down the tiger's throat. She kills the monster. She doesn't wait for a woodcutter. She doesn't wait for a huntsman. She identifies the threat, she outsmarts it, and she executes it. The predator becomes the prey. Now, look at Italy. Decades before Perrault put pen to paper, Italian storytellers were reciting the false grandmother. In this version, the villain is an ogress. The setting is even more surreal. The girl must pass through a gate of razor-sharp swords and a river that tries to drown her. When she reaches the house, the grandmother, the ogress, claims she is sick and resting. The cannibalism motif returns here, visceral and unhidden. The ogress feeds the girl beans that are actually teeth, but the Italian girl, like her Taiwanese counterpart, recognizes the danger. When the ogress tries to trap her in the bed, the girl uses the bathroom ruse. She ties the rope to a goat, slips out a window, and disappears into the night. When the ogress pulls the rope and finds a bleating goat, she screams in frustration. But the girl is already gone. Do you see the pattern? From the olive groves of Italy to the mountains of Taiwan to the villages of France, the source code of this story is exactly the same. It is a story about female agency. It is a story that acknowledges a brutal truth. The world is full of wolves, tigers, and ogres. They are stronger than you. They are faster than you. They will try to consume you, but the story also offers a solution. It doesn't tell you to be polite. It doesn't tell you to stay on the path. It tells you to be smart. It tells you that your mind is a weapon, and if you keep your wits about you, you can kill the beast. The introduction of the huntsman by the Grimms and the moral of submission by Perrault are the historical outliers. They are the edits of men who were uncomfortable with the idea of a girl who could kill a tiger. They looked at a story about female power and saw something that needed to be fixed. They didn't just rewrite a fairy tale. They tried to overwrite a fundamental piece of human psychology, the belief that the weak can overcome the strong through intelligence. When you look at the global evidence, the conclusion is undeniable. The damsel in distress trope wasn't inherent to the story. It was an artificial cage built around it. For 300 years, the version we've taught our children has been a lie. We traded the survivor for the victim. We traded the boiling oil for the red hood. We traded the triumph of the self for the reliance on the savior. But stories are resilient things. You can burn the books, you can rewrite the endings, you can change the morals, but you cannot kill the archetype. The clever girl has been waiting in the shadows of history, buried under layers of Victorian morality and Disney gloss. And now she is clawing her way back out. Because in the end, the most important question isn't who is the wolf. The most important question is, who is the girl? And the answer, as history shows us, is that she is nobody's victim. We have traced the journey of this story through 5 centuries. We have seen it evolve from a raw, medieval survival guide into a Victorian lecture on obedience. We have witnessed how the peasant girl who saved herself with nothing but a scatological lie and a piece of string was slowly strangled by the pen of the patriarch. First, Perrault stripped her naked and fed her to the wolf to warn women against sexual independence. Then, the Grimms cut her out of a stomach to teach children to submit to the state. For nearly 300 years, the culture convinced us that Red Riding Hood was a victim. We were told that her destiny was to be eaten and her salvation was to be silent. This was one of the most successful acts of cultural vandalism in history. It was a deliberate rewriting of the female narrative, transforming a hero into a helpless warning sign. But here is the thing about the truth. You can bury it under heavy stones. You can sew it up inside a wolf. You can rewrite the ending 1,000 times. But you cannot kill it. In the late 20th century, something shifted. The story of grandmother began to wake up. It started with authors like Angela Carter in 1979. In her masterpiece, The Company of Wolves, she performed a literary exorcism. She looked at Perrault's sexualized victim and didn't look away. Instead, she asked a dangerous question. What if the girl isn't afraid of the wolf? What if she wants him? Carter reclaimed the striptease. In her version, the girl burns her clothes in the fire, not because she is commanded to, but because she chooses to. She looks the wolf in the eye, the embodiment of danger, desire, and the wild, and she kisses him. She laughs at him. She sleeps between his paws. This wasn't just a twist, it was a restoration. Suddenly, the Red Hood stopped being a target. It stopped being a scarlet letter marking a sinner. It became a mantle of power. In modern retellings, from Neil Jordan's films to dark fantasy novels, Red is no longer the girl who needs the huntsman. She is the huntsman. She is the werewolf. She is the danger in the woods. We are seeing a return to the global code. Just like the Taiwanese girl with her boiling oil, or the Italian girl with her goat, the modern Red Riding Hood has regained her agency. She has picked up the axe that the Grimms tried to hand to the man. Why does this matter? Why should we care about the editing history of a nursery rhyme? Because stories are the software of our culture. When you tell a generation of girls that their role is to stay on the path and wait for rescue, you shape their reality. You teach them that safety comes from submission. But when you tell them the real history, when you tell them about the peasant girl who looked a monster in the face, tricked him, tied him to a tree, and walked home alive, you teach them something very different. You teach them that they are capable. You teach them that when the world is brutal, they can be sharper. You teach them that they don't need a woodsman to save them. They just need their wits. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood isn't about a wolf. It never was. It is a mirror. Perrault looked into it and saw a sinner. The Grimms looked into it and saw a subject. But the peasants, they looked into it and saw a survivor. And now, when you look into it, you know the truth. The wolf didn't win. The huntsman didn't save the day. The girl saved herself. She always has. And she always will. If you think the censorship of Little Red Riding Hood was disturbing, you haven't heard the truth about Sleeping Beauty. What if I told you the original prince didn't kiss her? He didn't wake her up at all. In the original 1634 version, he found her unconscious, assaulted her while she slept, and left her pregnant, and she didn't wake up until she gave birth to twins, who sucked the flax from her finger. The history of fairy tales is darker than you can imagine, and we are going to uncover all of it. So, if you want to ruin your childhood in the best way possible, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Next week, we're exposing the true, horrifying crimes of the charming princes. I'll see you in the woods. Why does this matter? Why should we care about the editing history of a nursery rhyme? Because stories are the software of our culture. When you tell a generation of girls that their role is to stay on the path and wait for rescue, you shape their reality. You teach them that safety comes from submission. But when you tell them the real history, when you tell them about the peasant girl who looked a monster in the face, tricked him, tied him to a tree, and walked home alive, you teach them something very different. You teach them that they are capable. You teach them that when the world is brutal, they can be sharper. You teach them that they don't need a woodsman to save them. They just need their wits. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood isn't about a wolf. It never was. It is a mirror. Perrault looked into it and saw a sinner. The Grimms looked into it and saw a subject. But the peasants, they looked into it and saw a survivor. The wolf didn't win. The huntsman didn't save the day. The girl saved herself. She always has, and she always will. But Red Riding Hood isn't the only victim of this censorship. She's just the first one we've uncovered. If you think the original version of this story was disturbing, you haven't heard the truth about Sleeping Beauty. What if I told you the original prince never kissed her? He didn't wake her up at all. In the original 1634 version, he found her unconscious, assaulted her while she slept, and left her pregnant. She didn't wake up by a magic spell. She woke up giving birth to twins while the prince was long gone. The history of fairy tales is darker than you can imagine, and we are going to uncover all of it, story by story. So, if you want to ruin your childhood in the best way possible, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Next week, we're exposing the true, horrifying crimes of the charming princes. I'll see you in the woods.